Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of how to talk policy and influence people. And today I'm joined by Dr. Lucy Johnstone, and I'm very excited to be speaking to you. Hi, Lucy. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine. Good to be here.
And so Lucy is one of the lead authors of this very exciting framework called the Power Threat Meaning Framework. And Professor Mary Boyle is the other co-author. There are a number of other collaborators. But before we get into what the Power Threat Meaning Framework actually is, maybe you can tell me a bit about yourself, Lucy, and your professional background and that type of thing, please.
Yes, so I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm based in the UK. I'm actually based in Bristol, in the southeast. You'll have seen us on the news.
Yes, with the statue. Yeah.
It's all been very exciting recently.
Yes.
I've been a clinical psychologist for many years. I've mainly worked in adult mental health settings, and I've also spent time working in academic settings and in training. And I gave up working for the NHS at the end of 2016. I'm currently describing myself as an independent trainer. And in fact, the Power Threat Meaning Framework has kind of become my job now, going around the place doing kind of talks and workshops on the framework.
Okay, excellent. So maybe you can describe what the Power Threat Meaning Framework actually is for a non-specialist audience. You know, how does it differ maybe from the traditional biomedical model of psychiatry that it seeks, I think, to rival? Or, you know, what's the difference really? What was the purpose of developing it in the first place, Lucy?
Okay, so the Power Threat Meaning Framework is a very long, ambitious document which was put together over a period of 5 years. I and Mary were the lead authors, and we had a project group of 7 people supporting us, other psychologists and service user survivors. So it's what we call a co-produced project.
Nice, yeah.
Okay, and a number of other people who made kind of expert contributions. And really it's emerged in the context of growing amounts of criticism of the traditional diagnostic way of understanding distress, the kind of idea that people have a medical illness of some sort that needs diagnosing. As I'm sure you know, there have been lots of criticisms of this. But this was our very ambitious attempt, not just to say, well, this might work better, or this model might work better, or this idea might work better, or this practice might work better, but to say we really want to go all the way back to first principles and try to come up with something that is fundamentally different in its core assumptions. And we did this by doing a massive overview of the research, by having many meetings over a period of years, by trying things out, by going down a number of kind of wrong alleyways and turning around again. And eventually in January 2018, we came up with a very long document, which actually has to read, but it's kind of the evidence on which the framework is based, and a shorter document, which is still quite long and quite dense. And this work was supported by my professional body, which is the Division of Clinical Psychology, which is a part of the British Psychological Society. So it's not an official DCP or BPS position, but that gives us a certain amount of credibility, and we're grateful to them for supporting and funding us. So the reason we chose the word framework is because it's actually something much bigger than any particular model or any particular theory, or quite a lot in common with a lot of other existing theories and practices. So whenever I present it, people quite often come up to me and say, it sounds just like community psychology, or it sounds just like cat therapy, or it sounds like whatever. And I think the reason for that is that we've tried to take the core principles of a number of existing approaches which work in non-diagnostic ways and give them a kind of conceptual, intellectual umbrella, if you like. So there's, one of our purposes was to give extra evidence and support and validation for those existing examples of good practice, of which there are many. So it's not saying stop everything and do this instead. It's saying here's extra support for the good work you're already doing. And really to make that those kind of approaches the default model, not if you're to come across it or you happen to be in a service that offers this, but really this should be our main way forward, non-diagnostic models of distress.
Okay.
The other main purpose was to come up with new and innovative ways of thinking about distress in our own right as authors of the framework, which people might want to use, you know, in the way, some of the ways suggested in the framework.
Is it actually anti-psychiatry then, or kind of anti-medication, or that type of thing?
I'm a bit allergic to that phrase.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know what it's like you're in Cork, aren't you?
I'm in Cork.
Yes, I don't know what it's like in Ireland, but in the UK and on social media, there's this very tiresome trend of using anti-psychiatry to dismiss, like you're taking some, you know, kind of very personally driven agenda to kind of psychiatry. So to be honest, I prefer to say it's pro-evidence. You know, actually, there's no evidence for the diagnostic model.
Yes, and
for the stuff
that is fascinating. Sorry to go across you.
Yeah, please comment.
That is actually fascinating, because I'm relatively new to this kind of exploration myself, and got into I've always been interested in mental health because I'm a human, and, you know, we all experience distress and stress and turmoil from time to time. But from my research with prisoners and looking at trauma, I've just become more and more interested in it, and how we've relegated some narratives that we don't even ask about, and we don't consider them valid. And then, you know, you'll have talk about all the severe and enduring mental illness in certain cohorts. But I think the public probably believe that there's a huge amount of evidence behind psychiatry. You know, that there's a lot of misinformation, actually.
Well, there is. I would call it propaganda.
Right.
Yeah, and not just the public. The public, we're fed this kind of, you know, I would call it propaganda.
Right.
Ideologically driven, you know, theories which have never had any evidence, and they're everywhere. So they're in media, they're in soap operas, they're in anti-stigma campaigns, but actually very few professionals question them either, although a growing number of do. And, you know, some survivors, service users are happy with those understandings, but there are a growing number who are saying, you know, this actually didn't help me. I got trapped in this diagnostic narrative. People who helped us develop the project.
And of course, then as well, the dominant biomedical model is very much propped up by big pharma, where really the only answers to mental and emotional distress are drugs of some kind, or very often that's the default position. There might be a bit of psychotherapy here or there. So is this framework then, is it a kind of biopsychosocial approach, looking at, you know, the environment and the past history of people, and about restoring their experiences, Lucy?
Well, very broadly speaking, I mean, the quickest way of summarising it is the popular survivor slogan: instead of asking what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me. I don't know if you've what's that's so. We've kind of expanded on that really important core question, which I think suggests a very significant shift from what's wrong with me, perhaps my brain, to what's happened in my life and how have I learned to survive. So actually we are a bit picky about the biopsychosocial model, because I mean, obviously we are drawing on the mountain of evidence that we already have about psychological and social and other factors in distress, because this is one of the odd things. We've got no evidence for biochemical imbalances and genetic factors, and yet we've got a mountain of evidence for, you know, poverty, abuse, trauma, discrimination, and all that kind of stuff. But from our perspective, the biopsychosocial model, I mean, in a way, it doesn't tell you anything. You know, all experiences have biological and psychological and social aspects, but we think this is often used to kind of water down the medical model just enough to make it acceptable and sound common sense. How can you get biopsychosocial very inclusive? But actually in practice, what it means is the bio is treated as the first and perhaps the only factor. And, you know, there are biological factors in distress, but the ones we are claiming that exist, you know, there's no evidence for that. So kind of way of, I would say, stripping an approach of its more radical, challenging aspects and making, you know, the same cake with a different layer of icing on top.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I interviewed a man called Dr. Austin Carroll a while ago, and I was asking him, he's an addiction doctor and working with very marginalized populations for a long time in Dublin. And I was asking him about adverse childhood experiences and trauma and, you know, the embodied aspect of that. And he, as a doctor, was kind of wary of the bio because like that can become the thing that traditionalists cling on to and forget about the psychosocial or the ecological variables.
So what we said in the framework is, of course, there are biological aspects of our experience. It'd be silly to deny that.
Mm-hmm.
We have a very long chapter on biological contributions to distress. And what we've said is these mediate and enable the expression of distress. They don't, in a simplistic sense, cause it.
Mm-hmm.
Not about this went wrong in your brain, now you have schizophrenia.
Yes.
Is about, and we've drawn a lot of this trauma-informed stuff, it is about the very interesting evidence that's emerging about the impact on your brain and body and your bodily functions of traumas and adversities and poor attachments and all the rest of it. It's really important stuff. The fact that those biological effects exist doesn't mean these are illnesses, you know.
Yes.
Having been abused or raped is not a medical illness. It's a response to a very serious trauma.
And so can you tell me, how has the model been received by mainstream psychiatry?
Well, we're not expecting mainstream psychiatry to rush and embrace it.
Right, okay.
But I mean, I think I would want to always distinguish between professions as a whole and individuals within it. So in fact, we've had a lot of support from particular psychiatrists, you know, so very good terms with the group that's called the Critical Psychiatry Network.
Yeah.
Welcoming to it. You interviewed Pat Bracken recently.
Yeah, that's right.
Invited me to present at 2 of their recent conferences. That's been fab. And conversely, some of my own colleagues, psychologists, really hate it. So
that's interesting. Yeah.
Yes. It's about ways of thinking, not professions as such.
Yes.
And so, I mean, it'd be very hard for mainstream psychiatry to embrace it without disappearing in a puff of smoke, because we are seeing this as a replacement. You know, this biomedical model or paradigm has failed. We need something very different. We're not claiming this is the new wonderful complete answer, but we are saying we really, really hope this is a step in the right direction. And it's been taken up, you know, very, very widely, far more widely than we thought it would be. So when we crawled in an exhausted way towards the launch date in January 2012, 2018, none of us had any idea where anyone would ever read this long and rather undigestible document. But since then, you know, I've been all around the UK. I've been to Spain several times, and Denmark and New Zealand and Australia and Brazil, and other project members have done the same. There is a Spanish translation. There are 3 other translations coming up. There are a number of services that are taking it on, and a number of professionals are taking it on in anything from very small ways, like I'm using this to think a little bit more about, you know, the social context that my clients come from, to much bigger ways. So there's quite an ambitious project to have a framework-informed approach to inpatient wards in a number of places in London. So that's very exciting.
Yes, absolutely. Just in terms of the concept of power, I mean, psychiatry is and mental health in general, there's a huge power dynamic there. And if you don't even ask people what happened to them, you know, if you just presume that they have some chemical imbalance or whatever, that it's all due to genetics, maybe if there's a history of mental illness in the family and you search no further, that is a massive exercise of power in and of itself. And in fact, I asked one psychiatrist, only one during my PhD, you know, how relevant was trauma in the prison population and among people in the forensic mental health services, and he got quite annoyed with me as a non-psychiatrist and non-mental health professional for daring to even ask questions, which was terribly interesting in terms of if I had a diagnosis, how easily I could be shut down.
Kind of borderline personality disorder, that.
Well, it was so interesting because he had a visceral reaction to my question, and
yeah.
you know, it was nothing all that untoward, but it just gave me a real insight into the kind of the massive stigma of a diagnosis in and of itself, that then you can be questioned forevermore. The veracity of what you say can be diminished every time thereafter.
Absolutely. There's a jargon term for that, testimonial injustice.
Right.
Whatever you say kind of doesn't count in the same way what other people say would count.
And I so got that in a small way from just that encounter, you know. And I suppose as well, in terms of trying to change paradigms or really shift mental models for any of us, you know, however our relative power levels or our expertise in this. In some ways, I think the public have an intrinsic understanding that if awful things happen to you, you know, if you're racially abused all the time and you're very poor and under constant stress, how could that not take a toll? In a way that sometimes the institutions tasked with dealing with difficult behavior don't always quite get.
Well, that's interesting.
But Lucy, then in terms of the adverse childhood experiences studies, because they've really captured the imaginations of lots of lay people, and you know, from public health experts to people working in early years services, and even now in the correctional setting a little bit. Do you find these studies helpful? Have they any role to play in the power threat meaning framework, or you know, are there limitations and difficulties with them, do you think?
Well, the power threat meaning framework draws quite heavily from the trauma-informed literature.
Okay.
But it's kind of bigger than that, but that's been a very important source of, you know, inspiration and evidence for us. So, and I personally, as a practitioner, found this kind of stuff enormously useful, and I didn't come across it until relatively late. It was about 10 years ago, I think, but mostly powerful. Partly because, I mean, you were saying a minute ago, some of this is common sense, and actually this is a really, really interesting and thorough way of supporting common sense, isn't it? People have shit lives, if I put it like that, and shit things happen to them, end up feeling like shit. Do you know what I mean? Actually, you don't need a degree to work that out, and professional training on top of it. So it's really, really important. It's led to, you know, enormously productive ways of thinking differently about supporting people with trauma and all that kind of stuff. So the approach we take in the framework is that that's really useful, and we don't take an uncritical perspective on anything because nothing's perfect. So I guess one of the things we've said is that, I mean, it depends how you do it, but trauma-informed practice isn't always, in our view, making explicit enough links with wider social and political context, which is where a lot of the roots of diversity lie. So there is a lot of stuff about, you know, kind of adverse community environments, but I don't think I've ever seen anyone, but I may just have missed it, making the link between the fact that America is the most economically unequal society in the world, and this is where the ACE studies emerged, and actually ultimately that's where the roots go back to, isn't it?
Yes.
And, you know, go back to all sorts of things we discuss at length in the trauma about, you know, capitalism and consumerism and individualization and materialism and things that are to do with our values, our whole way of life. So the other thing that the framework adds is looking at those kind of values and social norms and expectations, which are very often supported by power interests, coming back a bit to what you were saying. And this, we think can help account for the existence of often very extreme forms of distress, even in people who will say, when I had a loving upbringing and we had enough money and I've got a good job and a loving partner, and that may all be true. But what it's sometimes harder for people to see, I think, because we take on these ways of thinking as part of, you know, it's everyday life. We're breathing and, you know, encouraged to think and measure ourselves up against these kind of expectations. It's often harder to unpick those kind of ideological expectations. So we call that ideological power. And one example might be the the huge pressures on young people nowadays to kind of look, behave, dress, buy the right clothes, you know, have enough makeup, have the kind of the house or the social life, whatever you're supposed to have, which is enough to make anyone feel desperate by constantly comparing themselves in that way. I mean,
Yes.
another classic example, which dates back a bit, is, you know, I guess the 1950s housewife who's meant to be happy with her husband's meal on the table at 6 o'clock and 2 children round her ankles and not expecting to have a career of her own. And
yes,
many of those women ended up on benzodiazepines. And
Mm.
those were ideological expectations, which are harder to unpick because they're seen as the norm. And we do see psychiatry, and this is not something that its practitioners are deliberately consciously doing, but as a very powerful social method for reinforcing ideological expectations and social norms. So if you don't fit in, if you're a woman who's too angry, you
yeah.
ask questions, you might end up with a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, you know, to take one example.
And that's something, again, that I've only learned a bit about over the last few years, going to the Critical Voices Network conference at UCC, an amazing conference. But I've spoken to some women who've been given that awful diagnosis and heard Dr. J. Watts talk about it as well, and how so often trauma, massive trauma, is at the root of it. And again, why wouldn't you be angry? You know, this is the denial of emotions.
How do you expect it? But I think we would say in the framework that's true of all diagnoses.
Right.
That's a particularly stark example. But,
right. You know, that the diagnosis itself is a kind of a violence to the person almost, that boxes them in.
Well, exactly. Epistemic injustice is the phrase borrowed from a philosopher called Miranda Fricker, who's talked about how people may be deprived of the knowledge and confidence and information and support that they need to make sense of their own experiences in a way that suits them and fits with and fits and is helpful to them. And the minute you engage in the very, very powerful act, you know, as a professional, with someone feeling desperate in front of you, of saying, I, with all the authority of psychiatry and medicine, and telling you, you've got this, you have, as you've already said, you've kind of silenced someone. An interesting phrase for that, which we've borrowed from retired mental health nurse called Annette Grant, is narrative entrapment. You are stuck then, to quite a large extent, in this narrative of it's my fault, it's the mental illness, it's in me, it's in my brain. The fault is in me, and it's a very, very powerful way of stopping you looking further afield. One of the most important aspects of the framework is the need to link what we're calling threat responses and threats. So threat responses are all the many ways that we might react to very difficult life circumstances. They roughly correspond with psychiatric symptoms. Threat responses is a kind of trauma-informed idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
But we want to very clearly make the link between the threat responses and the threats, but we want to take the threats all the way back to the root causes in social injustice and inequality, often supported by ideological pressures.
So are the threats then kind of like fight, flight, freeze responses? So they could be aggressive behaviors, or I suppose psychotic symptoms, or, you know, I'm thinking about some of the long sentence males I might have met who engaged in risk-taking behaviors, impulsivity, not thinking through consequences, drug addictions, or, you know, whatever coping strategy, you know, to fight. I guess the drug addiction or the misuse of substances might be a way of fleeing the overwhelming distress, or numbing it, or what.
Absolutely. We call those threat responses. You know, you can call them what you like, but that's what we both mean by them, isn't it? It's ways of their survival responses, survival mechanisms.
Is the meaning part then the putting it all together, once you kind of look at, you know, what has happened to people or how has power been abused in their lives, and then get a sense of their symptoms or threat responses? Is it a meaning making process then? Is that what the meaning refers to?
in essence, as I said, what the framework is about is replacing the question, what's wrong with you, with what has happened to you. And we've kind of expanded that very important question into various other questions. And there's 4 core questions, which I'll read to you in a minute. And the idea is that these aren't meant to be taken literally in this order, in those words, like this. But the idea is that these are all important areas we need to think about, and they're kind of overlapping areas. Once you've answered one question, you'll find that you'll sort of on to the next one, and so on. And if we pay enough attention to all these areas of someone's life experiences, we are likely to be able to put together a story. And the story will be very different from a diagnostic one. So very briefly, you're right, the framework is arguing for meaning making and narrative. And you know, there are lots of ways of putting together narratives, but this is our particular take on it. So the first question is, what has happened to you? In framework terms, we call that, how is power operating in your life? So that includes all the kinds of power we've already discussed. It includes the ways people hurt each other and neglect each other, the ways people have to live without enough resources or decent housing, all the rest of it, but it also includes ideological pressures. And we put that first because it seemed to us that that's by definition missing from psychiatric diagnosis. In a way, a psychiatric diagnosis has the effect of, and I would say at some level has the purpose of, ruthlessly excluding all the power aspects. It's all about your illness.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
So that's the first question. The second one is, how did it affect you? In other words, what kind of threats does this pose? And it kind of follows from the power thing. So I felt afraid, I felt ashamed, I felt all sorts of, unpleasant feelings and reactions. The third question is, what sense did you make of it? In other words, what was the meaning of these experiences and events? So meaning is the core thread of everything, isn't it? Meaning-making creatures. It's not just what happened, but what did I decide about the event? Did I decide I was a useless person? Or would you ever love me? Or that life is unsafe, or whatever. But we've also traced back the meanings further than the individual to look at kind of the meanings that are around in the culture. Which are some of the things we've already said. If my husband's meal isn't on the table at 6 o'clock, does that mean I'm a useless 1950s housewife? That's a kind of joking example.
Yes.
But the meaning would come from the wider culture, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
And finally, what did you have to do to survive? So that's the threat responses. And that could include the things we call symptoms, but it could also include things that are harder to identify because they're socially valued. Like, we're all encouraged nowadays, I think, to work much too hard.
Sure, yeah. Be a perfectionist.
Be perfect, look perfect. I mean, I'm guilty of that.
Yeah.
So none of us can entirely free ourselves from this stuff. And once you've got some kind of response to those 4 questions, and we have a template at the back of the PTMF documents and a set of semi-structured questions to guide you through it, then you've got some idea about what is my story. And when you've got some idea of what is my story, you can, if you want to, start freeing yourself from the diagnostic narrative and thinking of different ways forward. And this applies to all of us because in the framework we do not recognise a distinction between mentally ill people over here and normal people over there. We're all in this. We're all subject to the negative impact of power. We all have distressing experiences at times. We all have to find ways of surviving and making meaning out of them.
Yeah, it's really interesting now as well in terms of COVID-19 and the pandemic, and how, we're not all similarly situated really, because some of us have more power and status than others and more money at our disposal and happier homes and all of that. But we're all a bit more distressed, I think, and stressed.
Well, if we're not, why not?
Yeah, well, there you go. And so I have read some articles saying, the pandemic is causing all this mental illness, and I think I've read a piece by yourself actually saying, no, actually, it's not. What is happening with us? Is it just that we are stressed and distressed, and are these normal responses to what we're going through, Lucy?
Yes, I did write a blog about it because I got getting so cross at seeing this nonsense everywhere. I mean, and I think one of the things that's happening about the pandemic is it's exposing some of the craziness of the psychiatric and psychological, to some extent, thinking. You know, here we are, we're facing illness, possible death, we can't go out of the house. It seems to have arisen in the context of, you know, environmental degradation and climate crisis that's facing the whole planet and the possible extinction of the entire species. So wouldn't be worried, and if you're not, what's the matter with you? And at the same time, we have this, you know, 6 out of 10 people now meet the criteria of an anxiety disorder. Well, I should hope they bloody do, but I mean, that is not a disorder. That is, in PTMF terms, that is a threat response that is very, very appropriate to the particular threats we're facing, which are probably bigger than we've ever faced as a species in our entire existence. So it's kind of crazy to say, you know, we've unfortunately had this global pandemic of a deadly virus, and by a really unfortunate coincidence, we've had another global epidemic, right? It's, you know,
as if we don't have enough going on. But it's like that whole Viktor Frankl quote about abnormal responses to abnormal situations are entirely normal, really, you know, to paraphrase.
Well, I agree with that. I think I probably prefer the word understandable, because normal has different meanings, doesn't it? You know, normal or socially normal, but understandable, certainly. Understandable, absolutely understandable. So in power threat meaning terms, you would need to keep the connection between the threat response, the anxiety, the whatever, and the threat, because otherwise we're not going to deal with the root causes. We're going to be ending up, as we do seem to be to some extent, handing out more pills, with saying, well, we need to look at this collective trauma, which is what it is, as a society. We need to heal as a society. We need to come out of this stronger if we possibly can. And people need what everybody needs. You know, they need connection. They need enough money to live on. They need a sense of, you know, purpose and meaning in their lives. That's going to be the cure for the pandemic of mental illness.
Indeed. And I suppose a big thing as well about this whole experience is that we just feel so unsafe. You know, we feel unsafe from a health perspective. Perhaps from a work point of view, lots of people lost their jobs. Some people who had amazing jobs were laid off, or they're doing them under very different circumstances and trying to homeschool children. And, you know, none of it is easy. And as you say, against the backdrop of a lot of political upheaval, mismanagement of the pandemic, you know, all sorts of things. But I did a training last year on polyvagal theory with Dr. Stephen Porges, which he kind of describes as a science of safety and social behavior. And one of the things that he said is that our bodies, human bodies, are on a quest to feel safe in the presence of other people. And that if we experience trauma, and particularly complex trauma in childhood or infancy, then we can have a thing called faulty neuroception. Neuroception, he defines as the unconscious detection of threat in our environment. And I'm just wondering, does the power threat meaning framework have a somatic experiencing component to it, where it looks at helping people maybe renegotiate some of the physical aspects of the trauma that's held in their body, Lucy?
Okay, so it's pitched at quite a broad level, as I say, but definitely it recognises there'll be somatic aspects, and the best way in may be by the body and not just verbally. And, you know, we've done a brief, I mean, no way complete, but a brief summary of these kind of very interesting approaches, which I think, I mean, I don't know a lot about that particular approach, but it's really, really interesting, important stuff. I guess just from what you say, I think from a framework perspective, I think there are some dangers in describing people as having something that's individually faulty. I mean, that it's adaptive, isn't it? It's there for and there's always a danger of then
again, that's a stigmatic term.
Tweak this so you won't be so worried about the unsafe world. But actually, at the moment, our worlds are unsafe.
Yeah, that's the whole thing, I suppose, about the maladaptive behaviours as well. They started off as very useful ways. Even dissociation is a
Indeed.
life-preserving
Yeah.
mechanism. Yeah.
Absolutely. Extraordinary creative ways. And they
Yeah.
may, if their usefulness, they may become problematic in their own right. But I think it's not about getting rid of symptoms and curing them. It's about acknowledging them and, you know, actually paying tribute to them. This is an important creative way, and how lucky that your mind and body were able to do this, because it's protected you.
And that is remarkable too, I think, to have a curious practitioner who helps you be curious about yourself and these adaptations and these threat responses. And kind of, there's one type of therapy, internal family systems, which is quite interesting that regard, looking at the child parts and these exiles, and again just kind of going, what was their value, and learning to kind of appreciate them, and that type of thing. And obviously, I suppose over time learn to manage them better, so that you're not overwhelmed by a part rising up and making it hard to function. But in terms of, I suppose, just the body and Black Lives Matter, because racism is about, or very often it's to do with the color of people's skin, unfortunately. There are all these protests around the world following George Floyd's
city.
Yes.
My wealthy city, it's got its money from slave trading.
Yes.
So.
And you know, we can't just pretend it's just America or just Bristol or just the UK or anywhere else. But does the power threat meaning framework, you know, does it deal with that type of issue? It strikes me that it does, from what you've described before, with the cultural and the historical and the collective traumas that are often neglected. Can you tell me anything about how race might be dealt with under this framework?
Well, definitely racial discrimination, along with other forms of discrimination, is, you know, a part of all our lives, and is a very real thing, and is very damaging in all sorts of ways. And it's one of the many, many threats that we want to make a link to and kind of highlight as being very important in, you know, the origins of many people's distress. So we've done a survey and a summary of all the kind of literature that actually we know about this. So, for example, the kind of links between racial discrimination and the stereotyping and all the rest of it, and various types of distress, and the fact that people with from particular ethnic backgrounds are more likely to, you know, be sectioned and have kind of more coercive interventions and all the rest of it. I think we've taken a particular perspective on this, which is that we are particularly opposed not just to the diagnostic narrative, and, you know, as it is across the UK and in most Western countries, but to the way in which it's being exported across the world under the heading of the global mental health movement. I think I mentioned this a bit. So this is a form of, one psychiatrist called Sue Fernando who has called this a kind of form of colonialism, which I think is very true, but it's a form that we need to be very aware of earlier forms of colonialism and how those are still very present. You know, they've been passed down through the generations, those wounds and hurts, they're still very present in our minds and our lives. One scandal we're really not aware of in anything like the way we should is the way we are doing something more subtle, but actually in some ways quite similar, exporting the diagnostic model across the globe to countries and cultures that didn't know they needed it.
Yes. I spoke to Dr. Pat Bracken, who spent some time in Uganda before, and he also did some work with a Maori psychiatrist. I think her name is Diana Kopua. And pardon me if I mispronounced her name, but I found her piece in Mad in America fascinating on that subject, entirely on the fact that the Western diagnostic model is quite ill-suited to Indigenous people and does not deal at all with the massive cultural and collective wounds, you know, the attempted... obliteration of a people.
Indeed.
And that's very unjust, because again, that's taking away an entire narrative that's so relevant to people, even if they don't sometimes maybe realize it, because so much of these transgenerational traumas, people don't talk sufficiently about, or they try and disconnect from it, because it's what good is it
no
to
words
focus?
for it sometimes. There's almost,
Yes.
in fact, I was lucky enough to go to New Zealand as well.
Okay.
I didn't meet Diana, but in fact we did subsequently write a joint article because she'd come across the framework.
Super.
I presented the framework to an audience which consisted, at least partly of Maori attenders and speakers. We had a fascinating 2 days where I presented the framework on the first day, and we had Maori understandings of distress presented by Indigenous speakers on the second day. And the idea was to see if we could find some commonalities by talking to each other and by offering a narrative-based approach. Now, of course, Maori understandings of distress, which were very new to me, narrative-based. They're about creation myths and things. And Diana and her colleagues have really creatively used these in order to set up services, as Pat told you, I'm sure, which are culturally appropriate for Maori people. One of the fascinating things that came out of this workshop was the recognition that in some ways we were talking similar languages. To the superficial level, they're quite different, but at a very core level, we were both talking about, power influences and threat responses, if you want to look at it like that. And we're talking about creating different narratives and putting people's experiences in a bigger context. And Diana later wrote in this article, which we published about a year or so ago, that she saw the framework as a kind of distant cousin.
Right.
Which was fab,
Yes.
It's very different, but it's got enough in common for us to be able to recognise our shared dilemmas from different cultural perspectives, and to be able to support and listen to each other, I hope, which is a very different kind of relationship than here we are with the wonderful science of psychiatry coming to terms with a Maori
pathologise you lot.
Psychosis.
Yeah. No, actually,
so that's encouraging.
That's very nice, all right, the distant cousin, because kin is so important, and the group
life is particularly,
yeah, and the connection. So that is quite moving, really, or at least it's suggestive of the fact that it is a helpful framework within which to think about these wider systemic and historical issues, I think. But just to return to the Black Lives Matter movement, Lucy, and values, because this has come up in a lot of the interviews lately, that we have the time now, much as we may not have welcomed it, and the opportunity to think about what kind of countries and world we want to live in, how we want to rear our children, how we want to support one another, because what it has shown us, the pandemic has shown that we're all vulnerable, and we actually have a lot less control than we might like to think, that we have agency, but in a public health threat, we can, for example, take very swift decisions about how to spend resources that were unthinkable.
Amazing.
2 months before.
You can do it just like that.
You can do it. And so from a policy perspective, do you engage much with mental health policy, and with politicians, and what might you be hoping can be achieved in terms of different values and, I suppose, reorienting mental health policy after this? Tricky question.
Tricky question. I assume by you mean the kind of project group?
Yes, yeah, sure.
Well, tricky question. I mean, you're right. We've learned so much in the pandemic, haven't we, that could be put to good use. We've learned who are the members of society we really rely on, and it turns out it's not so much bankers, but it's of nurses and delivery drivers and so on, and we've learned so much about the need for community, and we've learned so much about priorities, and it's so important that we take this learning forward, that we don't go kind of back to normal in a sense, and that is about values. You know, I think the pandemic can be seen as a real challenge to all our values, and perhaps at a most fundamental level, the way in which we've become disconnected to the natural world and the environment.
Sure.
You know, the planet's biting back, and this is something we've mentioned in the framework, but not nearly enough, to be honest. So one of the many things I've been thinking is and it's one of the things that came across was in New Zealand, how Maori people have a really strong sense of connection to the land, which we lost, and this is part of the result of that. That's one of the ways. The framework is an ongoing project. It's one of the ways I'd want to see it develop further.
We have given the planet a tiny break, you know, not because we wanted to, but because whatever reason, nature has created this virus and stuff. But in terms of, is there anything in terms of mental health policy that could usefully be done? Say, exiting the pandemic, do we have enough investment, for example, in the UK in mental health services, or are we over-investing in certain things and under-investing in others? Would it be better to prioritize housing and, you know, alleviating poverty than pumping more money into specialist services? Or I mean, they are very complicated questions, but given that the framework is so all-encompassing and a big picture approach, really, I suspect there's no one easy answer.
There's no one easy answer, and what the framework isn't is a kind of plan for action.
Right.
It's made some suggestions, but it's not a how to do it. It's a set of principles. And the idea was, once it's out there, if people are interested, they can take it into their particular settings and try it out and see what works and do some evaluations, and we can incorporate that back into further editions and so on. So it's not a plan for action, but I mean, the implications are certainly that mental health services need to change dramatically. And, you know, the traditional thing is to call for more investment, more services. But I mean, Sammy Tamimi, who's a psychiatrist you may have come across, often says, we actually don't want this. We don't want more of the same. We don't want more of what's not working.
Yeah.
And we don't, I mean, I would say we don't want more of what is actually turning people into patients.
Yes.
You know, I mean, there are very good mental health workers around working extraordinarily hard and doing good work, and I've met many of them. Hope I was to some extent one of them, but the system itself has the overall effect of creating patients. It turns people with problems into patients with illnesses. So if I was going to be really provocative, I'd say we need much less investment in mental health services. But, you know, we need investment in the right kind of services, but actually you're right, much more than that. We need investment in the things that we know, the evidence is there. We know what people require to live emotionally rewarding and, you know, also physically healthy and, you know, meaningful lives. And it's absolutely obvious things. It is about housing, it is about good schools, it is about feeling part of your community, it is about the values of society. It is about not having huge gaps between rich and poor. If we were able to do all of that, you know, the figures of referrals to mental health services would plummet.
Yes.
Reason.
Well, it's not all that dissimilar to the kind of calls for defunding the police in the United States, you know. Instead of policing violence and disorder and drug addiction and, you know, that type of thing. And I mean, we'll always need police, and we'll always also need mental health services of some kind.
I think we will realistically,
Yeah, because some people may just experience such a level of distress due to the stressors of their life that they need some help for some time. But it makes perfect sense to me as a non-expert in this area that we do need to radically shift what we have. And so often when I do hear people saying we need more services for children, you know, more child psychologists, they need to get their diagnosis. They're on a list for ADHD consultation for young.
We need trauma-informed schools, and there are trauma-informed schools.
Yeah.
We need, as much as possible, teachers and other people who come in contact with young children feeling encouraged and supported to do ordinary human things, have conversation with children, encourage connection and safety, that don't require some massive specialist training.
No.
There are few people who need specialist intervention, but really not all that many, I suspect. And meanwhile, we've got all these pathologizing narratives around, which are so damaging. It's like we're being psyched into believing we've all got some mental health problem.
Yeah.
And, I'm actually becoming allergic to the word mental health as well. And you
okay.
That's not a criticism of you. I'm a mental health professional. It's
No, I know. I know what you mean, that when a term becomes just another label, really. And it's an interesting thing, I think, about the adverse childhood experiences evidence, and how, I've met many people with extensive trauma histories that when they hear about it, they go, wow, that is me. I am one of the walking statistics, actually. And what, a bit like, I guess, the power threat meaning framework is, it gives a new narrative to them in the sense that I'm not broken. The statistics say all of these things, feeling suicidal, or, taking drugs, being violent, having relational problems are really quite normal. They're normal if you have that amount of them.
Yeah. How do you expect people to feel? Yeah.
How do you expect them to feel? And there is something that is freeing about providing people with information, whether, there's any screening. I know trauma-informed care says that you should routinely ask people about traumatic experiences, or, also attachment experiences, because connection is so important in all of this as well, isn't it, Lucy? In the sense that we are social beings, and our ability to feel safe in the world as women, as people of color, is contingent on how other people interact with us.
Of course it is.
Yeah. So just in a final question, the pandemic has also kind of shown us how wonderful people can be, how people, ordinary people can start volunteering and doing things that they wouldn't normally do, for the elderly or for more vulnerable members of the community. Are you hopeful that kind of motivation to be more connected and to be more civic minded maybe can persist once the economy is reopened in full?
Yeah, I am. I mean, I have to be hopeful. I'm optimistic by nature on the whole. I am hopeful. We've discovered some very precious things. We've rediscovered some very precious things. This is a massive opportunity for us as a society, and not just in Ireland and England, it's everywhere, isn't it? I am hopeful. I am hopeful. I'm also hopeful that this is yet another, brick in the wall of the destruction of the mental illness narrative. That we can actually see that, of course, we feel in these kind of particular ways when we're facing difficulties, and of course the way out is to support each other and move forward together and build a fairer society. That's if we think that somehow there's some kind of mechanism which will bring to our attention the fact that we're in serious danger of destroying our planet, then this is the message we need to take on board. And I suspect that we'll keep getting the messages until we do take it on board, and we need to take it on board. And
that's right.
And emerge into a better future.
And the other thing is the whole the video footage of police brutality, which Black people knew was there for a very long time. Unfortunately, lots of white people didn't believe it. And then other video footage of white people being verbally abusive has finally, it seems, galvanized much more support than, well, certainly has ever been there in my lifetime, and far more discussions around these issues. You can't be silent anymore. You can't look the other way or laugh at bad, hurtful jokes. That again, that humanity and civic mindedness needs to persist after the protests have ended.
It feels different. It feels like it's much more recognised that this is all of our problem, and find a solution, not just it's certain groups or certain actions or whatever. This is all of our problem.
Yes. Well, look, Lucy Johnstone, I will leave it there. Thank you so much for talking to me about this wonderful power threat meaning framework, which really has the potential to be quite revolutionary, and I hope that it will be. And thanks to all your colleagues who worked on it, and the service users and people who have survived psychiatry, who've given their inputs into it, because that's very, very important to listen to the voices of lived experience. And I wish you well in the future. Thank you.
I shall see you on Twitter.
Yes, this has been How to Talk Policy and Influence People with me, Jane Mulcahy. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you.